Welcome to the Greater Essex County District School Board 2025-26 Public Consultation Presentation. My name is Shelley Armstrong, and I am the Superintendent of Business and the Treasurer of the Board. I am joined by Mr. Sean Mayhew, Manager of Finance. The purpose of this presentation is to provide our community with information about public education funding, the Board's annual budget process, and opportunities for public consultation. We will start the presentation with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on land and surrounded by water, originally inhabited by Indigenous peoples who have traveled this area since time immemorial. This land is within the lands honored by the Wampum Treaties, agreements between the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenni Lenape, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Specifically, we would like to acknowledge the presence of the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and Huron-Wendat peoples. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture while remaining committed to moving forward respectfully with all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Let's begin with a quick overview of the Greater Essex County District School Board. The Greater Essex County District School Board serves over 36,000 students in 9 municipalities across Windsor and Essex County. The board is the 17th largest publicly funded school board in Ontario. The board employs over 5,000 staff, and it operates 53 elementary, 14 secondary, and 4 agency schools. In addition, the board provides services for our students in its Newcomer Reception Center. School board trustees are locally elected representatives of the public, and they are the community's advocate for public education. Trustees are required to carry out their responsibilities in a manner that assists the board in fulfilling its duties under the Education Act. The Greater Essex County District School Board's Board of Trustees includes 10 trustees. They are elected for a 4-year term through the municipal election process. The current Board of Trustees was elected in October 2022 and will serve until November 2026. The chairperson of the board is Gail Hatfield. While each trustee is a representative of a specific region or ward within the municipalities that are served by the GECDSB, trustees advocate on behalf of all students of the board. The board also has 2 student trustees representing the city and the county. Student trustees are elected by their peers in February of each year. The next few slides will discuss the board's 2025-26 budget development process. This slide highlights the legislative requirements of the budget process. The board's fiscal year is September 1 to August 31, coinciding with the school year. The board is required to balance its budget, meaning that expenses must equal the aggregate of provincial funding and other revenue sources. However, there is a provision in the Education Act that permits the board to use its accumulated surplus by up to 1% of its operating allocation, or approximately $4.8 million. Over the past 2 fiscal years' budgets, the board utilized greater than this provision when submitting its budgets to the Ministry of Education. The budget for the 25-26 must be submitted to the Ministry of Education by June 30th. This chart depicts the timing of the budget development process. The budget is a continuous cycle involving constant monitoring and review. Starting in February, the budget planning process begins with the development of enrollment forecasts and a budget risk analysis. Typically, in March or April, the Ministry of Education releases the core education funding announcement, outlining the funding for school boards. For 2025-26, it is anticipated that this announcement will be delayed due to the provincial election. In the winter and spring timeframe, the board will seek public consultation through a variety of means to obtain feedback from all stakeholders. The consultation process includes this presentation, a budget consultation survey, which was released on February the 10th, 2 public budget consultation meetings, and consultation with a variety of board and community committees. The budget is approved by trustees in June and submitted to the Ministry of Education by June 30th. In the fall, the board's financial statements for the school year are prepared and audited by external auditors. This measures the board's performance. The board also has an opportunity to revise its budget in December of each year based on updated information and revised assumptions. The board prepares 2 different types of budget each year, as indicated on this slide. The operating budget represents the day-to-day operations of the board. It includes expenses pertaining to classroom instruction, such as educational staff, textbooks, classroom supplies, computers, and non-classroom items, such as school operations, in-school administration, transportation, governance, and administration. The capital budget supports the infrastructure needs of the board, including new construction, major repairs and renovations, and replacement of building components. It is important that the board examines its cost structures to ensure that it operates within the ministry's funding parameters. The alignment of resources to district goals is paramount to ensuring funding is spent advancing the best interests of all students in a fair and equitable manner. The strategic priorities of the board are considered throughout the entire budget process, as is feedback received from public consultation. Student success and well-being is at the core of the budget development.
The presentation will now provide an overview of education funding. Education funds 72 district school boards and 10 school authorities. It represents approximately 90% of a school board's total operating revenue. The funding formula set forth by the ministry considers student enrollment, class size, number of schools in the school board, student and school needs, school location, demographic profile, teacher experience, and qualifications. School boards have flexibility in how they use funding to make local decisions that support the education outcomes of their students. School boards must work within an accountability framework. Education funding supports day-to-day operations through the annual core education funding, temporary special projects and activities that support student learning and well-being through responsive education programs funding, construction and improvement of school buildings through capital funding. While there is some flexibility to school boards, some funding is protected or enveloped to provide funding for key priorities such as students with special education needs, student mental health and wellness, student safety and well-being, Indigenous education. Education funding uses a series of calculations to determine the total funding amount for each school board. Municipalities provide part of the education funding through education property taxes, and the province of Ontario provides the remaining amount. The province sets the education property tax rate at each municipality. They collect this tax from local property owners on the government's behalf and give it to school boards in the municipality. Even if the education property tax municipalities provides changes from year to year, the funding the government provides ensure each school board receives its full funding entitlement. In response to the Better Schools and Students Outcome Act, the ministry revised the 24-25 education funding to enhance transparency and strengthen accountability in public funded education, to manage within the existing funding envelopes, The ministry has indicated that the revised education funding is neither an expansion or contraction of funding to minimize funding redistribution impacts and to make education funding easier to understand. Core education funding provides the majority of the funding to the school board and includes 6 funds and 27 allocations. Those funds are Classroom Staffing Fund, Learning Resources Fund, Special Education Fund, School Facilities Fund, School Transportation Fund, and School Board Administration Fund. The ministry also gives each school board's responsive education programs funding for 9 themes, which are listed on this slide. There's also the Building, Expanding, and Renewal Schools, also known as BERS, which provide funding for capital priorities, school condition improvement, temporary accommodations, portables, land purchases, childcare capital, and debt service costs. The presentation will now provide a current overview of the board's revised budgeted revenues and expenses for the 2024-25 fiscal year. Outlined on this slide is a summary of the board's 2024-25 budget deficit situation. The 24-25 in-year deficit is projected to be $6,379,834. It represents 1.4% of the board's 24-25 operating allocation. The 24-25 budget is non-compliant with Section 231(1) of the Education Act and Ontario Regulation 280-19. A multi-year financial recovery plan is therefore required. And by ministry directive, by the year 2026-27, the board must present a balanced budget and have an accumulated surplus balance of at least 2% of the board's operating allocation. The ministry has described the board's deficit as structural in nature. A deficit occurs when a school board spends more than it receives in funding. A structural deficit occurs when a budget deficit persists for some time. It will pose problems if left unaddressed. The 2024-25 budget deficit of $6.4 million is inclusive of $4.4 million of one-time revenues. Specific areas that contribute to the board's deficit include special education, supply staff and occasional staffing, student transportation, unfunded federal statutory benefits on payroll, and the number of unprescribed or unfunded staff positions at the board. In September 2024, the ministry approved the board's in-year deficit of $6.3 million, but required the board to complete and submit a multi-year financial recovery plan. The ministry requirements set forward by the plan include a balanced budget by 2026-27, accumulated surplus balance of at least 2% of operating allocation, estimated at $9 million, continued quarterly financial reporting, trustee approval required, and failure to make sustainable cost reductions will result in increased ministry oversight up to and including supervision. The multi-year recovery plan was approved by trustees at the public session of the board on November 5th, 2024. The plan was submitted to the ministry on November 6, 2024. The multi-year financial recovery plan included several cost reduction measures to address the in-year deficit over the next 2 fiscal years. Those reductions include reducing non-bargaining employee positions by 2, reducing occasional staff absences, reduce central office positions by 15.5, eliminating the International Baccalaureate program, phase out International Baccalaureate program secondary, reduce the social worker attendance counselor positions by 2, reduce psychologists, speech language pathologists by 5, and restructure supports for students in RISE. The 2024-25 revised budget reports revenues totaling $546 million. Of the total revenue, 93% of the board's revenues come from the Ministry of Education, with core education funding representing 88% of the total revenue. 1.1% of the board's revenue comes from the Responsive Education Programs funding. This funding is typically time-limited and designated for special priorities of the ministry, such as de-streaming, student mental health, and math interventions. Only 3% of the board's funding comes from sources other than the Ministry of Education, which is broken down in greater detail in the chart on the right. Enrollment is the primary driver of funding for the board. Therefore, it is important for the board to continuously monitor and analyze enrollment projections and trends. This slide shows the total enrollment levels over the last 4 years and the projected enrollment in 2024-25. As noted on the graph, student enrollment has been relatively flat over the past 4 years. Let's now review the board's operating expenses. 77.5% of all expenses of the board, or $427.3 million, directly support the classroom. This includes all classroom staff and school administration, as well as resources directly for the classroom and students. 20.2% of all expenses, or $69.3 million, support pupil accommodation and transportation. 2.3% of all expenses, or $12.7 million, support the administrative functions of the board.
Let's turn our attention to the development of the 2025-26 budget. As the 2025-26 budget process begins, challenges and uncertainties must be considered. The upcoming provincial election results in several risks to the 2025-26 budget, including whether a new provincial party will be elected, whether new or changing education funding will be announced, will the Ministry of Education priorities change, whether a new Minister of Education will be announced, noting that there have been 3 Ministers of Education in the last year, and probable delays in the announcement of ministry funding. Other political uncertainties also impact the budget development, including the imminent federal election and what impact a change in the governing party may have on government policies, impact of changes in immigration policies on residential growth and student enrollment, and the threat of U.S. and Canadian tariff war on the availability and price of goods and services. Other risks include projected enrollment increases and decreases will have an impact on funding levels. Enrollment of students with special education needs continue to rise, and the complexity of those needs is great. Special education staffing exceeds the positions funded by the Ministry of Education. The funding deficit in this area continues to rise. Student transportation is underfunded. Increased fuel and operator costs have added cost pressures to the board. And rising inflation is anticipated, along with a possible recession with the threat of a tariff war. As commodity prices rise, a budgeted dollar has less value than in prior years. Current rates of inflation exceed ministry benchmark funding increases. Utility costs also continue to rise due to the impact of the carbon tax, the conflict in Ukraine, and refurbishment of nuclear power plants. The Greater Essex County District School Board is committed to the continuous improvement of the budget process. Feedback is integral to the development of the board's annual budget. There are multiple ways to be part of the budget process. If you haven't already, the board encourages you to participate in the budget survey. The budget survey will close on February the 28th. A link is provided on the board's website. You can also email the board at budget@publicboard.ca with your comments and feedback. You can also contact your local trustee and have a discussion with them. Their contact information is also available on the board's website. Also, there are 2 opportunities scheduled for public consultation at the public board meetings. The public consultation meetings will be held on April 8th and May 13th. If you wish to speak as a delegate, instructions are available on the board's website. Thank you for your time today. It is our hope that this presentation was informative, and we welcome your comments in the budget process.